Today I'm going to talk to you about a system I made called DiffusionMesh, which is a vector graphic system that specializes in advanced gradients. Over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of research on an approach to gradients known as diffusion curves. With diffusion curves, you create a gradient by drawing some curves on a screen, and then assigning different colors to points on those curves. These colors are then diffused across the surface of your canvas and then blended together to create a smooth-looking gradient. Diffusion curves are very powerful, but they do have this one issue. They don't integrate well with traditional vector graphics tools. Their underlying graphics models are just too different from each other. For example, with diffusion curves, you create a drawing by drawing curves on a canvas, whereas with traditional vector graphics tools, you create your drawings by drawing closed shapes. With diffusion curves, you can assign colors to different points on your curves, whereas with traditional vector graphics tools, you assign colors to entire shapes. With diffusion curves, your colors are diffused across the entire canvas, whereas with traditional vector graphics tools, the colors you assign to a shape are limited to those shapes. And although diffusion curves are very good at creating smooth gradients that can fill irregular shapes, traditional vector graphics tools still have their advantages. They're very good at compositing different shapes together in different layers. And what DiffusionMesh tries to do is it tries to merge these two graphics models together so that we can have the powerful gradients of diffusion curves from within traditional vector graphics tools. So I'm now going to talk about this graphics model of DiffusionMesh. Just like traditional vector graphics tools, the basic graphics primitive of DiffusionMesh is the closed path shape. You create shapes by defining a path of straight and curved lines. You can then assign different colors to the nodes of these paths, and these colors will be blended together across the surface of the shape to create a smooth gradient. In addition, DiffusionMesh allows you to combine shapes together to create meshes of shapes. This allows you to describe objects with more complex geometry and more complex colorings. For example, let's say you wanted to create a drawing of a dark ball with a white highlight in the middle. You could model that ball as a single circle shape. You can only assign colors to the outline of the shape though, so you can never create that white highlight in the middle. But if you were to split the ball in two, creating a mesh of two shapes, you can create that white highlight in the middle. And that's how we specify the geometry of a drawing in DiffusionMesh. In addition to this, the graphics model of DiffusionMesh also specifies the properties of the gradient that will be generated for this input. We want properties for the gradient that will produce good-looking gradients, that will allow an artist to predict what their gradient will look like based on their input, and that gives artists control over the colors in their drawing. The first gradient property is that given a mesh with colors defined on the nodes, is that the color on the edges between nodes should be a linear interpolation of the colors on those nodes. This gives artists control over the colors at the edges of shapes. And then within each shape, the colors for the gradient will be chosen so as to maximize smoothness. I'll define smoothness later on in the talk. If you just have these two properties, you end up with visual artifacts when you have gradients over meshes. For example, here, with a mesh of two shapes, you'll see that there's a very visible seam where the two shapes join together. If you look at this cross-section of colors along this red dotted line, you'll see that the colors of the two shapes on either side of the seam are the same. But the derivatives of the colors on either side of the seam are not the same, and this is what makes the seam very noticeable. To get around this, DiffusionMesh requires that there be a C1 continuity of colors across seams. That means the derivatives of colors on either side of the seam should be the same. And if you do this, you'll notice that the seam becomes much less noticeable. Finally, the last property is a little bit subtle. Let's say you have a rectangle with the same gray color defined on all four corners. You would expect the gradient that would be generated for this would be a flat, shaded rectangle of that gray color, which it is. But let's say you add two rectangles to the sides with whites on either end. If you just have the smoothness of gradients and the continuity of colors at the seams, you end up with a gradient that looks like this. And it's a little bit hard to see, but if you take a horizontal cross-section of the colors through this gradient, you'll see that the middle rectangle is no longer a flat shaded rectangle. It's actually darker in the middle. The colors end up overshooting the grays that you defined on the nodes, and it ends up being darker in the middle. This is a little bit unexpected, so to give artists more control over their colors, DiffusionMesh defines the property that the colors within each shape must be limited to the range of colors defined on the nodes of that shape. And if you do that, you end up with a flat shaded rectangle in the middle, as expected, with gradients on the end. So I'll now move on to talking about the algorithm that DiffusionMesh uses to actually generate a gradient that satisfies all of these properties. Here are the basic stages of the DiffusionMesh algorithm. Given some shapes with colors defined on the nodes, DiffusionMesh will first generate a triangle mesh over these shapes. It will then diffuse colors across this triangle mesh to create a smooth gradient. This results in a bunch of triangles with colors defined on all the corners of the triangles. We can easily render these triangles to the screen using basic graphics hardware. The most interesting stage of this algorithm is the diffusion of colors, so I'm going to talk about that in more detail. When diffusing colors, we want to create a smooth gradient. That means we need to minimize the curvature of colors across the surface of the shapes. In addition, we need to apply some ad hoc fix-ups to the colors to get all the gradient properties that we wanted. To make the calculations simpler, DiffusionMesh makes the assumption that the triangles on the triangle mesh are colored with linear interpolation. This means that when we minimize the curvature of colors across the surface, we can work with discrete triangles in the triangle mesh instead of with the surface as a whole. To give you some intuition of how the algorithm works, let's look at a 1D case. So let's say we have this triangle mesh with colors defined on two nodes. We want to assign colors to the internal nodes of the mesh to create a smooth gradient. Now remember, a smooth gradient means we want to minimize the curvature of colors across the surface of the mesh. When working with discrete triangles, that means we want to minimize the differences in the color derivatives between adjacent triangles. So we want to assign a color to this internal node that minimizes the differences in the slopes of the adjacent triangles. We do this calculation for all of the internal nodes, and we repeat the calculation again and again until it eventually converges to a smooth gradient. Whenever we assign a color to a node, we compare it to the colors of neighboring nodes. If it's outside that range of colors, we push it down until it's within the range of colors. This is a little bit ad hoc, but it turns out the algorithm still ends up converging to something useful, a smooth gradient with all the properties that we wanted. The algorithm converges a little bit slowly, so to make things converge faster, DiffusionMesh first generates a very coarse triangle mesh for its shapes, and then calculates a gradient for this very coarse mesh. It then refines this mesh to create a more detailed triangle mesh and calculates the gradient for this more detailed mesh, using the gradient for the coarse mesh as initial values for its gradient calculations. And it then repeats this. It iteratively refines the mesh to create a more detailed triangle mesh, and then iteratively calculates the gradient for these more detailed triangle meshes. And it keeps doing this until it creates a gradient of the quality that it wants. And it turns out that calculating the gradient iteratively this way is faster than just generating a very detailed triangle mesh right at the beginning and calculating the gradient over this very detailed triangle mesh. So how well does DiffusionMesh work? Well, let's take a look. Here are some drawings made in DiffusionMesh. The box shows that you can create traditional vector graphics using DiffusionMesh. The dog shows that you can create subtle gradients over irregular shapes. And the face shows that you can composite meshes together to create more complex drawings. So it's clear that DiffusionMesh works. Unfortunately, DiffusionMesh is a little bit slow. To generate the gradient for the dog takes 3 seconds, and to generate the gradient for the face takes 11 seconds. Despite it being slow, it's still possible to create an interactive artist tool using DiffusionMesh. To make things fast enough, we use 3 tricks. The first trick is, if you remember, DiffusionMesh creates its gradients iteratively. It first calculates a very rough version of the gradient and then iteratively creates more refined versions. Now, this very rough gradient can be calculated very quickly, just a fraction of a second. And the more refined gradients can be calculated in a background thread and then displayed as they are ready. So that means we can create a very rough gradient that an artist can work with and manipulate very quickly, and if they wait a bit, a more refined version will be filled in. The second trick is we only have to recalculate the gradient for the parts of the drawing that are being modified. So if an artist is, say, modifying the ear of this dog, we only have to recalculate the gradient for that ear. We don't have to recalculate the gradient for the face or the body of the dog. And thirdly, if you remember, the output of the DiffusionMesh algorithm is a bunch of triangles that are displayed using graphics hardware. These triangles are a form of vector output. So you can scroll around your drawing or zoom in and out of your drawing without having to recalculate the gradient. You can just take the triangles that were previously calculated and send them to the graphics hardware again. And that's DiffusionMesh. As you can see, DiffusionMesh successfully merges diffusion curves with traditional vector graphics tools. It's able to do this by using meshes as the underlying graphics primitive and not curves. The algorithm for DiffusionMesh is slow, but it's still possible to create a usable interactive artist tool using the algorithm. DiffusionMesh's gradients are easy to make and of reasonable quality. If you're interested, you can take a look at the DiffusionMesh paper, which contains more details about the algorithm and takes a deeper look at the experience of creating drawings with DiffusionMesh. Thank you.